We begin the current Daf Mesechtes Nedarim Daf Pei Beis. We begin 10 lines down by the top of the Amud, where the Gemara introduces a teaching that will relate back to Halacha of our Mishnah, which was speaking about the ability of the husband, what type of cases could he do hafara on. We said there was inu nefesh in the Mishnah. We spoke about in the Brisa regarding the Dvarim Shebin Al-Bina. And that the Gemara continues on that theme of the husband's hafara. Something to discuss in today's daf, which actually we just discussed just before. Nedarim Daf, we spoke about that. Now then we continue regarding Medina Zu, regarding when a woman takes a neder just from this country or this state, and when it's Hanos Pliny, specifically not even know from that person. Also this idea we said of Kula Privim Rabbi, we mentioned that already. And Nodrim occurs. And the Gemara has an interesting question regarding if she takes a neder from two different loaves of bread. One is inu nefesh and the other one's not inu nefesh, regarding how you translate the halacha of that the husband is made for her neder in totality. How would that affect the other loaf of bread that's not inu nefesh, if you had the ability to be made for that or not? So, when I mentioned the previous Daf, Rabbi agrees that the Nadarim pertaining to Rechitza and Kishur and Tashmish Amita, although they're not inu nefesh, Dvarim Shebin Al-Bina. We had a question regarding Tashmish Amita Kon Rabbanan. Is that inu nefesh, or is that only Dvarim Shebin Al-Bina? And the Gemara wanted to resolve from the Nedarim Yehudim. We see but she's telling the Yehudim if it's a nidur shan nefesh, then should affect everyone else at all. We said no, you can't prove it because there's a kula picking Rabbi Yisi, and the Mishnah begins Rabbi Yisi and ends Rabbi Yisi unnecessarily to tell us that yes, they're all like the older Mishnayos in our parak Rabbi Yisi, and therefore you didn't really resolve the opinion of the Rabbanan. So the round says we are stringent and it can only be meifel atzmai as an edbin elbin regarding tashmish amit. Now the Gemara continues with the following teaching: Omer Shmuel Mishmei de Levi. 10 lines down at the top of the Yamid. So Shmuel says, name of Levi, Kol Nedarim, all vows, Baal Mefer Ishtai. A husband can be Mefer for his wife. Meaning, as the Ram points out, obviously, if it's in the Neder, in the Nefesh, he could be Mefered. Chutz min, except for Hanaasi al Ploini. She says that my pleasure is on that person, meaning she's forbidding her pleasure on another person. She'ina Mefer, that the husband cannot be Mefer, because although it's Inu Nefesh, because it's prohibiting pleasure, but it's not prohibiting her from having pleasure, prohibiting someone else from having pleasure. So that it cannot be made for. Although not plainly alive, let's say it's the other way around. She prohibits that person's pleasure on her neighbor, Shprinza, she doesn't want her, so I'm not taking anything anymore from this woman ever again. Whenever you take something from her, she expects the whole world from you. So then Mayfree can be made for that neder, because since it's inu nefesh, even though it's only from one person that she took a neder from, the husband could say, no, there's inu nefesh, you always need some sugar, and you always go to Malki, and this and that, now you're taking a neder. No, I'm being made for that neder. Says the Gemara, how could you say this? It's not we learned in our Mishnah the following halacha. We said, Peres Medina Zulai. If you say that the produce of this country is forbidden on me, so the Mishnah said, you cannot be made for that. Bring it from another city, from another state, whatever Medina means. But the Peres of that Medina is forbidden on her, and it cannot be made for. So all the more so, if she just says one person that prohibiting benefit from, how could Shmuel say he can be made for? Because inu nefesh. A whole city, a whole country is not inu nefesh. So Amar Yisrael says, no. The case of our Mishnah is the Amar where she says, Shatavi, and the Ran adds on the word, one more word, Atah. In other words, she says, the Peres of this Medina is forbidden on me if you bring it. But when someone else brings it, she's not making it forbidden on herself. Oh, so since there's a way to remedy to get the Peres of that country through someone else, so that's not the same thing as prohibiting someone, even one individual's pleasure on her, where there's no way of remedying that from that person. So therefore, Shmuel is correct. Even if it's one person that she's prohibiting, it's considered inu nefesh. Your whole country is not inu nefesh? No, I'm not prohibiting on the whole country. It's you bringing from this country. But someone else? Yeah, that's going to be okay. But then the Ran asks, he says, if you're going to say, if that's the case, so then the Mishnah should have said, not that he could bring from another country, it should have said, let someone else bring her from the Peres of that Medina. So why are you saying specifically that she can get from another country? Says Ran, what you could say is that the reason why we said that he could bring it to her from another country, very important, you said the Ran says. Says because if there was no way of having any takana through the husband, and it was only, let's say, you could do a takana through someone else, because that someone else could bring from this country, you still would be able to do hafara. Because the ratio that says, koinim peres oilam olai, the ratio that says that I'm prohibiting all the Peres of the world on me. The Mishnah said, Hariza Yafer. Now, says the Ran, that's also talking about the same case when she says to the husband that you cannot, I'm not going to get it from you, because that's similar to the case of the Sefer. And even so, the Reisha told us that even though you could be masakin by someone else, because someone else can bring it from the parents of the world, even so, said the Reisha of the Mishnah, since there's no takana through the husband, hers a yafer. Because it's like as if she says, Hanos pliny alai, that I'm prohibiting all benefit of my husband on me. And that's actually Shmuel's halacha, just that pliny is her husband. Therefore, the Sefer says, no, the husband can bring it from another Medina to say that the reason why in the Reisha we said you can be made for does not apply by the Sefer. Because the Reisha, since she has no takana through the husband, because she's prohibiting all payers of the whole world that the husband is going to bring, he can be made for. But in the Sefer, since there is a takana through the husband that he can bring from another Medina, therefore he cannot be made for. What do you mean? What's with the Medina itself? No, that someone else can bring. So you have to cover both bases. That's why the Mishnah said not only is it that someone else can bring from the Medina, but that even the husband himself can bring it from some other Medina. Okay, so Gemara says Tashma to bring another raya, not like Shmuel, again from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Peretz chen b'nei ze'alai. Our Mishnah said further, if let's say I'm taking a neder that the payers of this store is forbidden on me. So ein yochel lahafer. The Mishnah said that no, it cannot be mefer. Wait a second, why not? A store is not less than a person. A store has definitely more produce than your neighbor. So, but Shmuel said you can be mefer. That's an inu nefesh. Says even though hachanam here also the ka'amr which she said shetavi ata. She said I'm taking a neder that I'm not going to take from you and you buy in that store. Oh, okay. But since it's possible for her to have enough from those payers of that store through someone else, and also the husband himself could bring from a different store, therefore you cannot be mefer. But you're right, if it was totality from that store, of course you'd be able to be mefer. The Gemara says, wait a second. But the Mishnah said a little bit further. The Mishnah said, if let's say the hana was only from that store, meaning the husband was only getting credit from that store, so hariz yafer. So then, he could be made for even if it's just that store. Says the Gemara of Yam, but if you say the Ka'amra that you tell me it's where she said to the husband, Shetavi ato, I'm just not taking from that store that you bring me from there. So am I yafer? Why could it be made for? What do you mean? She could have enough from that store through someone else. Ella obviously, says the Gemara. Mid Sefer, in the fact, there's a little of a cheshbon over here. Mid Sefer, in the fact that the case of the Sefer, that says that when he could be made for, you're telling me it must be talking about where she made the payers of that store totally forbidden on herself, even when it's Deloy Maisi Balhava, even when it's not the husband bringing it, even if it, let's say, where she herself is bringing it. Because like we said, if it's only being forbidden on her, only when the husband brings it, the case of Shtabiata, then why could it be made for? Rather, obviously, it's in all situations that she made it forbidden on herself. If that's the case, then the Reisha also, which said the case of Peretz chen b'nei ze'alai, when it's not the only store that gives him the credit, that you said he could not be made for, that must be also the same type of case. The Kamaisi that she's bringing it, not only that you're going to bring. Wait a second. And still the Mishnah is saying that he cannot be made for. Well, that's not like Shmuel. Shmuel said, if you take a total neder from one person, you can be made for, because it's in nefesh. So if you take a total neder from a store, for sure, you should be able to be made for, but the Mishnah says you cannot be made for. Because as the Ran says, there's no difference between the Reish and the Sefer regarding the storekeeper. The only difference is the Reish is talking about where that wasn't his sole proprietor, it was not the only store that's giving him credit. And the Sefer is saying that no, if it's the only one. But they're both talking about where it was a total case of, I'm not going to have enough from that. So why does the Reish say he cannot be made for? So the Gemara says, Ella, rather, you're right. Most definitely that the Reisha is talking about where she had made the entirety of that store's payers forbidden on herself. And ein yachal lahafer, still the husband cannot be made for, even though the kamaisi even though it's talking about where she herself will bring the payers, she made the neder on that, and even so, it's not difficult on Shmuel. Why is it not difficult on Shmuel? Didn't Shmuel say that if it's a total neder on some entity that's considered in nefesh, and you could be mefer? Says the Gemara, as a Ketintam and Beis, the reason why it's not difficult is because it must need in Reb Yosi. The Mishnah is going like Reb Yosi, which, and we already pointed this out already before, that you're right, according to Reb Yosi, that Reb Yosi is the most stringent in what's considered inu nefesh. He says you cannot be mefer because of inu nefesh, but Shmuel that says that you could be mefer even sounds like as inu nefesh, he's holding like the Rabbanan. And because the Amar of Huna, he says, Kulei Pirkei Reb Yosi, and this is the point we just mentioned before. This whole parak, right, including our Mishnah, is all Reb Yosi. So you're right, according to Rabbi Yosi, you're right. You see from our Mishnah that if you take a neder just from one store, he doesn't hold these more stringent ones because there's hastenish in the nefesh, not showering, not in the nefesh, not putting him in, not in the nefesh. So he would say, yes, if you took it from one store, it's also not in the nefesh. So you cannot be mefer. Shmuel, that says even one person is in the nefesh, even mefer is going like the Rabbanan, who they're more lenient in their interpretation of what's considered in the nefesh. Now, this is parenthetical, and the Ran's going to explain in a second why we're saying this next words. When this halacha is mentioned in the Mishnah, that you cannot be mefer, what does that mean? When you take a neder from one store, it should mean a nefesh. That's because of in a nefesh. Again, because Rabbi Yossi holds it's not in a nefesh. Of a mefer, but nedarim should be nedarim. But as nedarim that affect the relationship, that lower level, that Rabbi Yossi would agree, like by loy erchatz, that would include. Now, the Ram points out 2 points. This is on the top of this Amud Beis. He says, why did we have to say these words that Rav Huna said the whole parak is Rabbi Yossi? That's not for our Mishnah itself, which we're bringing the raya from against Shmuel, because our Mishnah said Divrei Rabbi Yossi. You wouldn't have to tell me that. Says the Ram, no, it's only because the Gemara was concerned that maybe you're going to ask from another Mishnah, Pei Gimel Beis, which the Mishnah there says, if let's say she says, I'm taking that, I'm not having any benefit from the creatures, from the people in the world, that the Mishnah there says he cannot be mefer. Now that just says anonymously, it doesn't say to Rabbi Yossi. So therefore we had to preface and say that no, the whole paragraph is Rabbi Yossi, and then you cannot ask from that at all, because Shmuel, who says that you take a neder, not having a neder from the Brias, you could be mefer, because he goes like Drabbon. And that's why we had to say it, even though it's not really pertinent from the case that we're asking from. That was the Mishnah, but we're saying because you might have asked from Mishnah later on. Now, another point around says, this that we have to be lengthy and to say, what does our Mishnah mean, Ein Yochel Hafer, by the case of the store? That's only because Nidrin and Nefesh. But you could be mefer because the Dvarim should be not, meaning even according to Rabbi Yossi, who our Mishnah is like. Wait a second, says the Ran. To answer the question on Shmuel, we didn't have to say more than just to say that Haman Rabbi Yossi. And Shmuel's like, Rabbanan, why do I need you to get into this commentary? He says, no. It's very interesting the way he says. He says, the reason is because if Rabbi Yossi would hold that, let's say you take a neder from that one store, that you cannot be made for even for the lower level of Dvarim Shabbat, then you wouldn't be able to say that the Rabban would hold that it's considered even a neder that has in and nefesh. Because, like we see by the case of bathing and not bathing, according to Rabban, it's in and nefesh. According to Rabbi Yossi, it's at least the lower level of Dvarim Shabbat. And therefore we have to say that according to Rabbi Yossi, it's also Dvarim Shabbat. And therefore, actually, now we could say Shmuel, according to Rabbanan, that it would be considered as inu nefesh. So it's like, it's too far of a distance. If according to Rabbi Yossi, it wouldn't be anything, it wouldn't be mistabed to say that according to Rabbanan, it would be considered as inu nefesh. But Shmuel wants to say it's inu nefesh. So the Gemara had to tell me that according to Rabbi Yossi, it's at least Dvarim Shabbat, and therefore now, it's a good answer, but Shmuel's like Rabbanan would hold that it's inu nefesh. Now another teaching from Amr Yehuda, and this is from Amr Shmuel, the same Shmuel, has a very interesting case. Nodrim mishtei kakaras. A woman takes a neder from 2 loaves of bread. For example, she says 2 loaves of bread, these 2 loaves of bread are forbidden on me. Takes a neder. Said gluten is terrible, she just watched the whole seminar. That's it. These 2 loaves of bread are forbidden on me. Now, ba'achas mis'ana. One of them is affliction for her because it's good, geschmacka, French baguette, toasted, as aroma, as refined bread. So her not eating that loaf of bread would be inu nefesh. Ba'achas ein mis'ana. The other one is not affliction, because it's this coarse, old, fatirik in the schwarze bread, not geschmack anyway. Now, very interesting question. What's the halacha on the hafara of this neder? So says Shmuel, since he can be made for the neder, because of the one loaf that does have inu nefesh, so made for l'shein misana. So you can make also to the loaf of bread that has no inui. So even though there's no inu nefesh, but since both of them are food items, so because you can be made for the one that is inui, with that, it draws it with it, the other loaf, even though there's no inui. And even though he just made hafar stam. But the whole neder is going to be nullified when he does this hafar. But Rav Asam Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. He says, no, meifel misana, you can only do the hafar on the loaf of bread that's inu nefesh. They meifel l'shem misana, but you cannot do hafar for the loaf that is not inui. Why? Because he doesn't hold of this concept called gerara, of dragging along with it this other case, this other loaf of bread. So therefore, even if he explicitly is mefer to the 2 loaves, to the one that's inui and the one that's not inui, says the Rabbi Yochanan, it's not going to nullify for the other loaf that doesn't have an inui. That's what the machlokes is. Now, says the Ran, that's how my teachers explained this. He said, but I didn't see any one of my teachers explaining what would be the reason of this halach of Shmuel. If you can be made for ina nefesh, but how does it draw along with it? How does it schlep with it? Not a loaf of bread, there's no ina nefesh. You have no right to be made for something that's not ina nefesh. So he says, very interesting svara. What's this machlokes Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan? He says, the pasuk says, Isha yikemena, v'isha yiferena. That the husband goes along and he's made for it. What's yiferenu? So the Gemara comes out from that pasuk later on of Peizayin and Aleph that the husband has to be made for the entire neder. Because yiferenu, with the vav there at the end, it, in the singular, sounds like you have to be made for the whole neder. If you made for only part of it, then even the part that you were made for is not nullified. That's the primary girson that's sugi later on, as we'll explain there with Siyat Shema, he says. So that's why Shmuel says, since she took a neder from 2 loaves of bread, it's like one neder. Now, he cannot be made for a halfway, half-baked, no pun intended, neder, because it says yiferenu. So therefore, since he has to be made for, and when he's made for, he has to be made for the whole thing, and he can be made for it because of the affliction that there is on the loaf of bread that's gishmak, so he can be made for also to the loaf that's not gishmak. Because if you say he cannot be made for, it comes out that even the zafara on what there is inu is not going to be effective. And since the Torah gives him a reshus to be made for a neder that has inu nefesh, so karchach, he can be made for even for the one that there's no inu, because the inu one is dependent on the non-inu one. And if you say he cannot be made for, so the inu nefesh. So I don't care how much of it inu nefesh is going to be affliction, that's also going to be made for the whole thing. So what's pshat in Rabbi Yochanan? No, he says you can only made for the one that's inu, not the one that does not have inu, because he holds, although Yiferdena says the Torah, which sounds like it has to be made for the whole thing and not part of it, that's to say that you have to be made for all of the neder that you could be made for. Yiferdena, the pasuk is going on inu nefesh, and therefore, if you are made for anything that has inu nefesh, with that it's sufficient. That's considered Yiferdena, and therefore you can be made for to the loaf that has inu, and not to the loaf that doesn't have inu. Beautiful pshat in the machlokes over here. But then the Ran says, if you're going to say, wait a second, if that's the case, that Shmuel holds that Yiferdena is going on the whole neder, even on that half, which is not really from the type that you are able to be made for. Still the husband can be made for, like we explained. So wait a second, what do you do with the Mishnah that we already quoted just before, on the Mishnah Daf later on the Tzadim Abayz? We quoted this in the beginning of this Daf, from the previous Daf, the end of the previous Daf. If a woman says, Natulam Yehudim, she says, I am taken from the Jewish people. So he said, what the halacha is that he can nullify his portion, and he goes and he has intimacy with her, but she's forbidden for the rest of the Jewish people. Question is, why? Since you tell me Yiferdenu, the Torah tells you that you have to be made for the whole thing, since he's made for his portion, even though the rest of the Jewish people's intimacy has nothing to do with him, but it should be able to also be made for the Chelek HaYehudim, because if not, then it's not possible, because you have to be made for the whole thing. So it says the Ran, no, what you could say is that maybe he holds, interesting, it's another spalt, another differentiation, that Shmuel holds, although Yiferdenu means the whole thing and not part of it, even if it's the loaf of bread that there's no inu nefesh, he holds Nalik Rabbi Yochanan, even that's included, but only on inu nefesh itself would you say that if some of it is inu nefesh, then even the non-inu nefesh is included, and you have to be made for the whole thing. Because we don't find that this concept is by Dvar Mishnah B'nai L'Beinah. Because the Mishnah later on, and the Brisa that the Gemara brings over there, which talks about the klal of Yiferdenu, that has to be the whole thing, talks about cases of inu nefesh, not by things that are B'nai L'Beinah. So the Ran wants to make a chiluk. He wants to say that this that Shmuel holds, Yiferdenu, that you have to make for the whole thing, even the non-inu nefesh part, is only in the category of inu nefesh, not in the category of Dvar Mishnah B'nai L'Beinah. There, Yiferdenu does not have to include the non-B'nai L'Beinah, and therefore, Tashmash Mit, which is not inu nefesh for, it's just affecting the relationship, will only be for him and not for others. And he says, I'll tell you this svar. It's miltzul de shaycha b'taimah. It says, it makes sense. It's logical. Why? Because in neder of inu nefesh, what's the pshat that you can be made for? It doesn't bother the husband. It's just the wife's going to be in pain. So he's like a coach. He's like watching over her. So it's because of her that you can be made for, because it's inu for her. So therefore, it's not appropriate to do a half-baked hafara, because she's still going to be in pain at the end of the day. So once you're doing it, you have to do totally, which according to Shmuel, that includes even the other coarse piece of bread. You do the whole thing. But when it comes to Dvar Mishnah B'nai L'Beinah, what's the pshat that the husband's allowed to be made for? It's because of what bothers him. Nothing to do with her. She doesn't want this, but it affects me in the relationship. So whatever does not bother him does not affect him, so it doesn't bother him. So whatever doesn't bother him, so go ahead, that neder could be valid. Because it's not bothering you, it's not bothering me, it's not in an effort, it's not dvarim shebein el benah. It's some other Jew that you cannot have intimacy with. Fine, go ahead, no problem. And therefore, that's why it would make sense that this teaching of Shmuel, that it's Yifrenu Kulai, even on the non-Inu Nefesh loaf, would not include regarding Dvarim Shebein El Benah, that would not mean Yifrenu Kulai. That you could do Miktasai, and you could only be made for Chalkai. No. No. Kurara is only by Inu Nefesh and not by Dvarim Shebein El Benah. Now the Gemara just ends off the same thing, just Vegadamri, some say it was a question. It wasn't said in the statement. In the first verse we had Rav Asi saying the name of Rabbi Yechanan. The second verse we just said it was a question. He asked Rav Asi Rabbi Yechanan, Nodrim Mishteka Karish, she takes another from 2 loaves of bread, Be'achas Masan, Be'achas Masan. The one she is afflicted by, a geschmacka, juicy loaf of bread. Be'achas Masan, the other one, it doesn't really bother her. It's the one you get, the one in the bag that's been there for 3 months on the shelf. It's not really a nefesh. Ma'at Salacha in his hafara. Amalei Rabbi Yechanan said to him, again, the same thing as the first version, just here was a question and answer, not like Shmuel. Shmuel said you can make for both of them. Because he says no. Yifrenu Kula is only on that which has in the nefesh. That you do totally, but the other one, which is not in the nefesh, would not be included. Thank you to any time for hosting us.